Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to the first webinar for 2023, organised by the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, with our supporters, Law Asia, the Law Association for Asia and the Pacific, and UN Environment Programme. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this first of our new series on environmental law videos and webinars. And also just to announce that this year, Ariel will be relaunching its Seeds of Justice podcasts, and we're going to be looking at topical issues every month over the next year, looking at some of the key environmental issues and also talking to some of our key environmental players and environmental law players to see what 2023 has in store for us. For those of you thinking back to 2022 and the end of 2022, it was quite an exceptional year for environmental law and environmental treaties and the environment. We had the COP15 of the UN Biodiversity Conference on the Convention on Biological Diversity. We also had the COP27, the Climate Change Conference. We also had the CITES discussions, and we had certainly discussions about the Plastics Treaty. We had Oceans Treaty discussions that did not result in any binding agreement. And certainly within ASEAN, we've also had starting discussions on an ASEAN framework agreement on environmental rights. We've also had in the Pacific a lot of discussions about environmental law and the creation of a potential regional environmental law dispute resolution mechanism, an environmental court or tribunal. So it really has, 2022 was a really big year for environmental law with lots of really interesting things happening. And we thought that for this one, for our first webinar of 2023, we'd start to think, get some of our environmental lawyers and environmental law champions to just identify some of the key issues that they thought happened at those conferences or at those conferences of parties and where to for the future. And I think we can all acknowledge that this year is going to be another vitally important year for the environment and for environmental law. And so to introduce the first observations, I think, a brief observation on 2022 encapsulated in 5 minutes, I'd like to introduce Dr. Georgina Lloyd-Rivera. She is the Regional Coordinator for Asia and the Pacific of the Environmental Law and Governance for the UN Environment Programme, based in Bangkok. Her work covers the area of environmental rights, environmental crime, technical assistance in environmental law and capacity building at the national and regional level. Georgina has been involved in capacity building for environmental law within Southeast Asia and has provided advice to governments and non-governmental stakeholders on environmental law and policy issues. She holds a doctorate in law, a master's of environmental law and bachelor of environmental science from the University of Sydney. And it's a great pleasure to welcome Georgie here today. Please, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much for collaborating on this first webinar for 2023. As you said, 2022 was a really busy year for environmental multilateralism. We started the year with the second in-person resumed session of the United Nations Environment Assembly 5.2. Not only were there the COPs that you mentioned, but there was also the fourth Conference of the Parties for the Minamata, the second segment for that. There was also COP15 for UNCCD. We had Stockholm Plus 50. We also then had the resumed in-person sessions for the BRS COPs. There was COP15 of the parties to the Basel Convention. There was the 10th Conference of the Parties for the Rotterdam Convention, also the 10th Conference of the Parties for the Stockholm Convention. We also had the 76th UN General Assembly, where there were really important developments for the space of environment and human rights. As you mentioned, there was also the 19th Conference of the Parties for CITES, the 27th Conference of the Parties for the UNFCCC, the first International Negotiating Committee for the Plastics Treaty, and of course, the 15th Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity. So a lot took place, and there were other things besides these, but a lot happened in the space for environmental multilateralism. For the UN General Assembly, of course, we had on the 28th of July, by a record vote of 161 parties in favor, none against, and only 8 abstentions, the adoption of a resolution recognizing the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This resolution calls upon states, international organizations, business, and other stakeholders to scale up efforts to ensure a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment for all. It notes that a healthy environment is related to other rights and existing international law. It requires the full implementation of the multilateral environmental agreements under the principles of international law. So this resolution is going to have a catalytic impact, and we're already seeing this in the 39th General Recommendation of the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. For the first time ever, we saw a treaty body explicitly refer to the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. And that was in relation to their recommendation on the rights of Indigenous women and girls. We also saw in the outcome document from COP27 of the UNFCCC the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment recognized. So this was the Sharm el-Sheikh Implementation Plan, which states that acknowledging that climate change is a common concern of humankind, parties should, when taking action to address climate change, respect, promote, and consider their respective obligations on human rights, the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the right to health, the right of Indigenous peoples, local communities, migrants, children, persons with disabilities, and people in vulnerable situations, and the right to development, as well as gender equality, empowerment of women, and intergenerational equity. So, of course, then that leads us to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, which also reached a really historic decision to establish a loss and damage fund. And I'm sure that Ramchat is going to talk to us more about this in a moment. So I won't go into the details, but now we need to start thinking about how is this loss and damage fund going to be operationalized? Who is going to pay for the fund? Where will the money come from? But it was for many a highlight of COP27. At CITES COP19, which was held in Panama, there were over 180 states parties that discussed, of course, the international trade around wild species of fauna and flora. There were 450 species included onto CITES lists for the first time. And depending on the conservation status of other species, some were moved up their appendices to prohibit international trade. For others, there was a relaxation of trade restrictions on certain species of birds, reptiles, and mammals, which some may see as conservation success. There was also some discussions at the Conference of the Parties around risks of zoonotic spillover. And this is going to be further taken up at the next COP, linking the trade of wild fauna and flora with zoonotic risk. At the first INC on plastics, the starting of the negotiations for the plastics treaty in Puente del Este in Uruguay, there were 1,500 or so present and an additional 1,100 individuals online. It was huge levels of participation, which demonstrated the expectations for really ambitious agreement. There were 2 work streams agreed, and these are going to look further at the objectives, scopes, obligations, control measures, as well as looking at financing, institutional arrangements, and stakeholder engagement towards this important landmark treaty. And I'm sure we're going to hear more about that from Andre. And then the final update, of course, is from the 15th Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, where we saw the adoption of the first global framework on biodiversity since the Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted in 2010. So we had 196 countries adopting the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes 4 goals and 23 targets to be achieved by 2030. And this isn't just the GBF. There's also a package of measures that also look at monitoring. It also looks at reporting and capacity building. And I think Nicole is going to share a lot more about these exciting developments. So while we have lots of multilateral negotiations, which indicating this global recognition of the urgent need to address the triple planetary crisis, it's still important for us to consider and discuss what such agreements and decisions mean at the regional level in the Asia Pacific region, and also at the national level. How do these global governance discussions and agreements become operationalized to really see the aspirations and reflect meaningful results that have been decided on the global sphere? So with those very quick updates, Matthew, I will hand back to you and we can get into some more details.
Thank you very much, Georgie. And I have to say that some of those things I'd forgotten. And yet I was thinking, well, it couldn't all have happened in 2022. But certainly the UN General Assembly, the resolution on the clean, healthy and sustainable environment. I mean, I think these are some of the things that we've seen really transform over the last year. And the next speaker is going to talk a little bit more on some of the human rights and environment issues. And we're just having a short little change in the program, the format of our program, so that after Romchat has given her presentations, we'll have a 10-minute break for questions because both Georgie and Romchat have to go back to another meeting that's currently being held in Bangkok at the UN, the Science Policy Panel and other things that are happening at the moment. But I do think it's really exciting from Georgie's outline of that to show that there's been a lot of discussion and a lot of decisions made that are going to require a lot of action in 2023 and beyond. And I think we're now really focusing, and hopefully policymakers are really focusing on the importance of 2030 to actually start things and start achieving things, certainly to ensure that by 2040 and 2050, we have actually met many of these targets that sadly have not been met to date. And I think it's exciting in terms of the interest in the Global Plastics Treaty, where that might go this year, and more importantly, what part can we play to ensure that it is a successful negotiation, successful outcome. So I'd now like to introduce Romchat Ratakonkul, sorry, Romchat, as the National Human Rights Officer of Climate Change and Human Rights. She's been working as the regional focal point on climate change and environment for the UN Human Rights Regional Office for Southeast Asia since 2019. And previously, she served the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand as the Human Rights Officer and Investigative Officer on the Human Rights Protection Bureau, focused on economic, social and cultural rights and business and human rights. Romchat, please, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I hope everyone can hear me and see me clearly. And I would like to thank Georgie and Matthew who remind everyone about the UN General Assembly on the right to the safe, clean, and healthy environment. Can you please let me know if you can see me, my screen clearly?
Oh, great. Thank you, Romchat. Oh, it just clicked.
Sorry for the technical issue. Hello?
Oh, yes, we can't see your screen yet.
Oh, sorry. Can you see my screen now?
That's great. Yes.
Yes. So sorry again for this technical issue after 3 years of the pandemic. But I would like to thank Ariel and Law Asia and UNEP for inviting me to share the perspective from human rights. As Georgie and Matthew already introduced, last year we have the very historic and landmark resolution from the UN General Assembly following from the Human Rights Council resolution on the recognition of the right to the healthy environment. That's why me, as the international human rights lawyer who is now working on environment, have to working closely with you on this area of work on climate change and environment. And just a little disclaimer here that because I am from the UN Human Rights Office, so my presentation will frame around the analysis on the impact of human rights and the outcome of COP27 that have the impact on climate or environmental justice, including human rights, especially for Southeast Asia. The name of the event is the Opportunities for Southeast Asia, but I would also like to talk about some challenges waiting ahead for COP28, especially for developing countries in ASEAN. And as everyone already know, that ASEAN is among one of the most affected regions on climate impact. According to the Climate Risk Index by Human Watch, Asia, three countries in Asia, Thailand, Myanmar, and Philippines, among the top of the country worldwide, most affected by the extreme weather event from 2020 to 2021. And that's why the member states of ASEAN, prior to the Conference of the Parties, has issued a joint statement call up on the parties of the Paris Agreement to discuss and negotiate on the most impact and issues that need to be addressed in the international level. And prior to the COP27 again, in 2021, ASEAN also released the publication on the climate change states in ASEAN. So it has been acknowledged that ASEAN need to take the more climate ambition and stand ready for the impact by receiving the resources or capacity to adapt to the impact of climate change. So as I mentioned, prior to COP27, ASEAN already released its joint statement. So my presentation today will frame among what ASEAN expect as the outcome of COP27 and what is the real outcome if that already fulfill the expectation from the ASEAN member states. So I will quickly, I only have 15 minutes, so I will quickly update or present about loss and damage, finance and technologies, mitigation, adaptation, the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations. And the last one is the next step and what we have to do or prepare for COP28. And Georgie already captured it really well. One of the most hot issue at the COP27 is loss and damage, because this issue, and I believe everyone from South Asia or even Asia has been experienced by ourselves because of the salient or intensities of the impact of the extreme weather event. And this issue has been long time championed by developing countries, particularly those most vulnerable to the climate impact, such as the small states, islands, or the least developed country. And for Southeast Asia countries, who is belong to the G77 and China bloc, has been negotiating and has put forward a proposal for the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility. It has been a very contentious issue since the beginning, because the parties has to negotiate if the loss and damage finance will be put on the agenda. And during the negotiations, developed and developing countries had contrasting positions concerning loss and damage finance, resulting in the intense negotiations. On the view of developing countries, include all of the member states of ASEAN, were unified in our their demand for the establishment of the loss and damage fund that would be paid for by developed countries, while developed countries resist the proposal for the fund over concerns, and it could open them to the liabilities for the impact of the historical emission and put forward for the other proposal instead. COP27 supposed to end on 18th of November, but it took another 2 days after the schedule at the end of COP27 until all the parties reached the consensus to reach on the establishment of loss and damage fund. So there is the agreement to establish a transitional committee to make recommendations on how to operationalize the fund. But as Josie mentioned, the question in remain is how this will be done. And we still have to wait and see what will be the outcome of loss and fundings negotiation. And parties also agree that on the institutional arrangement to operationalize the Santiago network for loss and damage to catalyze technical assistance to developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effect of climate change. So that is one the most hot topic of COP27 this year. The next issue is climate finance and technologies. According to ASEAN statement, ASEAN member states emphasize that the means of implementation commit by developed country parties, including finance, technology development, and transfer capacity building are key drivers to facilitate ASEAN member states to low greenhouse gas emissions, green and climate resilient and development. So we see the several financial pledges come out of COP27 made by developed countries at COP. For example, new pledge totaling more than $230 million US were made to the adaptation fund. But the ASEAN member states urge developed country parties to fulfill their commitment to providing 100 billion USD per year to develop the countries and increase their climate finance beyond this objective. So this is supposed to be the floor, not the ceiling for climate finance. Next issue is the mitigation. So it's made clear by IPCC that the carbon emission must decline by about 45% from 2010 levels by 2030 and reach net zero around 2050 in order to limit the global warming to 1.5 Celsius limit so there will be no catastrophic impact on climate change. However, when we look at the UNEP emission gap report 2020, it highlights that the world is still on the track for increasing the dangerous level of warming, and this currently policy in place could result in global temperature rise of 2.8 Celsius by 2010, which would trigger even more devastating climate impact. According to many views from many stakeholders, we see that the parties fail to reach the agreement on phasing out the coal and other fossil fuels or setting emission peaking periods and greenhouse gas emission pledges, and implementation are not on track to achieve Paris Agreement aim. So the outcome of COP27 merely reproduced language from COP26 concerning phase down of coal power, holding up progress on tackling the root cause of the intensity climate crisis. On adaptation, I think I will not have enough time for that, but of course adaptation is a really key issue for the vulnerable region in the world, and we need more support and more progress on adaptation. So ASEAN members call upon parties to strengthen adaptation effort and also call parties to ensure the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh. So we see a lot of development and agree to move forward on the global goal on adaptation, which we conclude in at COP28 this year, and to inform the first global stocktake. What is I would like to highlight here is the issue of the vulnerable population affected by climate change. Of course, ASEAN member states call upon parties of the UNFCCC and Paris Agreement to promote an intergenerational approach to climate action that is woman and gender responsive, and with utmost consideration on the plight of vulnerable groups. It shall proceed in collaboration among stakeholders, and in particular allowed local communities to participate in the governance mechanism. So we see that there has the adoption of the 5-year plan on action for climate empowerment immediately viewed on the gender action plan. And at this COP27, we see the first children and youth pavilion and the first ever youth-led climate forum at the COP27. ASEAN also considered the importance of gender equalities and youth, private sector engagement, vulnerable groups, human rights, local communities, and indigenous people in tackling climate change, and including the importance of indigenous people and their traditional knowledge, technique, and technologies. But I see Matthew already opened his camera. Quickly on that, on COP27 and human rights, as Georgie mentioned, this is the first time that we can put the right to the healthy environment in the COP27 cover text, which is the political outcome. And OSCHR has contributed to the integration of human rights into this text, including the action for climate empowerment, the capacity building decisions, and the decision on the operationalization of the San Diego network on loss and damage. But what we have seen, I went to COP27 myself. One of the worrying concerns is the limiting civic space and restriction of the participation of civil society at this COP27. We have observed some of the barriers emerging in the lead up and during the negotiation, including the intimidation, harassment, and surveillance. So in conclusion, at COP27, we reached the breakthrough agreement to establish the finance infrastructure of loss and damage for the developing countries. But the big question is how this fund will be operationalized, and what is in practice, what will it mean for ASEAN member states? How can it be used for issue affect ASEAN states, and how people in the national level access to that fund? And among states, what will be the fund? Will be it in the form of grant or loan, which is another issue that we have to see and follow. However, many viewers seem that this COP27 fell short on its objective to reduce emissions and to avoid the worst impact of climate change. So the failure to step up ambition, of course, will pose a catastrophic risk to human rights. And there is a continued need for the increased funding and capacity building for the ASEAN member states. And the last one, the participation and civic space at the COP28 will be the issue that we have to work more and see and to increase the participation of indigenous people or environmental human rights defenders at these negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Romchat, for that great overview. a lot of material to get in a short period of time. I'm wondering, Georgie, if you want to just also turn on your camera so we can have a quick. So we've got now time for a few questions to our UN, and thank you very much everyone who's putting their questions in the Q&A box, and Ramchat and Georgie will also try and answer some before they have to leave. But I just wanted to I guess pick up on the last point, one of the key points that you mentioned, Ramchat, in that this growing challenge for civil society. On the one hand, you mentioned at the climate change COP that there was, for the first ever time, a youth-led climate pavilion. But at the same time, also Sharm el-Sheikh and Egypt, the focus of the climate COP also focused on the repression and the closing civil spaces in areas that have traditionally been open in terms of climate change, where governments have recognised that communities and individuals and civil society have a real value and obligation, obviously, to comply, but a real value, and they can bring really important contributions. I'm just wondering, both Georgie and Ramchat, where you think that's going to go, both at the convention side this year, but also in terms of trying to, as you also pointed out, the need to operationalise at a national level, where it is becoming increasingly difficult to refer to environmental issues within the region. So Ramchat and Georgie, and maybe also Nicole and Andres, this is something you might also want to think about and address after your presentations as well.
Ramchat, did you want to start? Okay, so perhaps I can start. So I think we've seen that, as Ramchat mentioned, there was for the first time a Children's and Youth Pavilion at the COP. And over the last few years, we've seen by some delegations increasing emphasis on a diversity of representation within the delegation. Increasingly more of the delegations are having a youth delegate formally join the delegation. But at the same time, when representatives are not part of formal delegations, there has been a somewhat shrinking of space for other voices. In the last two COPs particularly, that has been evident or reported upon. I think the other point that you raised, Matthew, is we are getting some significant ambitions recognized at the global level by governments and decided within the ambit of these conferences of the parties. But it is now the responsibility of states parties to those conventions to realize those agreements. And it can be in different, at the national context, it can be quite sensitive to say, how do we actually reflect these ambitions, whether it be within the nationally determined contributions, whether it be within climate change policies or others, and what role at the national level then do different stakeholder groups have? What is the role for environmental human rights defenders? What is the role for educators? What is the role for lawyers and others in supporting governments to realize those commitments that are made in the global sphere? But many of these different groups, they definitely have a role to play, and it may be in just supporting governments to meet these commitments. Maybe it's also supporting governments to hold them accountable to these commitments as well.
Thank you very much, Georgie, and thank you, Matthew, for the questions. But I think what is more important than the outcome of COP27 or the outcome of annual conference of the parties is the real implementation. Is not what is the outcome, of course, of what has been implemented in the year, the progress made in the countries go back to the global level, and the government discuss among themselves, and it has to come back to the implementation in the country as well. For example, the NDCs or National Adaptation Plan have to be updated and implement and reflect what the government or member states has commit or make a pledge at the international level. And again, I talk a lot about the loss and damage fund, but the real issue is that how that fund, not only how this can be transferred from the developed country to the developing countries, how the government, if the fund has been operationalized, how can women, people, or local community access to those funds? So that is the internet connection between these outcomes and what happened on the ground.
And I think there you also mentioned, this big funding gap. So just turning to some of the questions in the chat, and I might amalgamate a few. We had a couple of questions about current loss and damage fund framework proposal. So if we can look at that sort of what currently is in existence. And there was a couple of good questions. One was asking how could that or loss and damage be used by communities affected by projects claiming to be climate mitigation projects, such as incinerators or and other projects that might be meant to be climate friendly, but they might have an impact on communities. So how does that fund mechanism work for that? And also, is it possible to account international, or I hold to account international businesses and companies who are proven to be contributing globally to greenhouse gas emissions, and how they could be liable for developing countries or to pay for countries to who are going to be impacted on climate change to deal with adaptation and mitigation. I wonder if you could answer those questions in relation to the current, your knowledge of the current framework at the moment.
As mentioned, we only have the agreement, but it will be the work of the committee set up, how it will be operationalized. So we have to set up that facility first in order to discuss the procedures and how the fund will work, right? We don't have the mechanism yet.
So that, because I noticed also the last COP, the Paris Rule Book was finally adopted, but that was a process that took 6 years. I imagine that there's more pressure to have a loss and damage fund set up more quickly. Is that the case, or does this look as if it's still going to take a long time before we get any details about what it might be?
That is, I think, that is what we have to put the pressure and demand for the government to really negotiate, because it is a long-standing issue for many years at the COP. So I think that is the issue that we have to follow really closely at this COP28. But I also would like to address the question about the mitigation, the impact of the mitigation project, and how we hold the company accountability for their greenhouse gas emissions. That is where we put the human rights at the entry point, because you can see more and more civil society organization or local communities fight and ask for the accountabilities or even the action from the government for their inaction or action on the basis of human rights. So that's why we really want and think that the COP27 cover text that put climate change will make more sense for the climate change basis or for climate litigation to help states or business accountable.
So, look, we also have a couple of questions about youth involvement, talking about youth involvement in climate change. Is there any emphasis on involvement of schools and strengthening education in schools? And a question that asks, how can we convince the youth or the community about awareness of climate change? So just a couple of questions. education in schools?
One of the really good outcomes of the COP27 is the Action for Climate Empowerment, which I follow in the negotiation closely myself. And Action for Climate Empowerment is the real issue of human rights, because if you look at the 6 principles of Action for Climate Empowerment, which is the program, the official program of Conference of the Parties, is the right to education, access to information, the right to participation, and of course the role of youth as well. And the last one is the international cooperation. And in the operationalize text or the action plan of the Action for Climate Empowerment have human rights incorporate in the text. So that means we can have human rights. Even your question about the right to education. So that means when a government need to implement Action for Climate empowerment program in their countries, they have to consider their human rights obligation as well.
So thank you very much, Ramchat. And just the last question before we move on to our next speakers. There's a question about a development of the framework on recognising and protecting environmental rights in ASEAN, including I think, sort of an ASEAN variation or approach to the Aarhus Convention in Europe and the Escazú Convention in Latin America and the Caribbean. That process is now under the leadership of Aicha, and our questioner asks us, can you provide an update on this? What do you expect of the process, and how can the process be inclusive and involve the voices of environmental and human rights defenders?
Okay. Actually, it's the work we are working together with many UN agencies and with ARIA as well. But we are in the process of assisting the ASEAN, especially the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, because we see that this is a really good and the right time. We have the momentum from the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council resolution. We have the good model from Aarhus Convention and Escazú Agreement. And I think this is a good opportunity to be creative or try to push something that is even better or advanced than the existing models. So of course, the process is also very important, equally than the with the text as well. So we, of course, we advocate for the inclusive and participation of all stakeholders that will be impacted by the environmental degradation and climate change in the region. And we hope that it will be send a really strong commitment for government and private sector as well.
So thank you. Georgie, did you want to make any final updates, comments?
Yeah, so as this person who posted the question mentioned, this is a process that is being led by Aicha. So it will be further discussed at the upcoming Aicha meeting that is going to be held towards the end of this month. And then following discussions at the upcoming Aicha meeting, there would then be the next step towards the establishment of the working group and the meeting of the working group to start developing the draft of this environmental rights framework. And alongside the work of the working group, of course, as Ramchat mentioned, the process for consultation and participation of all stakeholders is critical. So alongside the preparation of the draft itself, there would be a consultation process on that draft. The formation and the details of that consultation have not yet been elaborated, and this is going to be a multi-year process in the development of this framework. So it's not something that is just going to be finalized within the next 12 months. It's going to be an iterative process, likely over a couple of years. And so once the consultation strategy or framework is outlined, there will also be further opportunities for stakeholders to give input on that. But it will all be done under the leadership of the Aicha representatives.
So thank you. Look, and thank everyone for questions. We've got a second opportunity for questions at the end, but can I first of all just thank Romchat and Georgie for taking the time out of your busy days to give us that update. And it certainly shows that there's probably a lot going to be happening in 2023, which hopefully means a lot more webinars, and certainly an interesting webinar I just thought about was how we make governments accountable and how we can hold governments to account for the human rights impacts, but also in ensuring that they are complying with the international obligations. So thank you again, Georgie and Romchat, and we'll now move on to our next speaker from Parabucus, and we'll move into biodiversity, a little bit beyond climate change. And our next speaker is indeed Nicole Torres from Parabucus. She's the Program Director of Parabucus, a women's-led, Asia-based international consultancy focused on laws and policies related to climate change, the environment, and sustainable development. Her present expertise includes community land tenure, biodiversity management, illegal wildlife trade, forests and climate change, and solid waste management. She's been following issues around the UN Global Convention on Biological Diversity since 2014, and she's been working in the environmental and human rights sector since 2007. We've also been pleased to partner with Parabucus on a number of Seeds of Justice discussions where we looked at what was happening around the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention of Parties when it was in Kunming, I think. So, Nicole, the screen is now yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you very much to Ariel and the organizers for having us today. We're so honored to be in such esteemed company and with such an active group of participants, and we really look forward to engaging with everyone in the question and answer portion. So Ariel has very kindly agreed to share my slides for me. So if we might move on to the next one, please. Okay. So the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, as we might know, already comes to us with some delay. It was supposed to be the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which, as the name suggests, should have been agreed in 2020 in Kunming, China. But after the global pandemic threw everything out of the sphere, and with the recent surges of cases in China, the conference was moved to Montreal last year. There were efforts to hold global discussions virtual discussions globally and make some progress there. And some drafts were prepared to give parties something to discuss in Montreal, even if the online meetings could be a little challenging. So finally, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was agreed on in December last year in Montreal. And it comes on the heels of these two reports listed on the slide, the 2019 IPBES Global Assessment and the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5, both of which have less than ideal findings. So just to recap very, very quickly, the IPBES Global Assessment found that biodiversity is declining at a faster rate than at any point in history. And it identified the 5 direct drivers of biodiversity loss and changes in nature, which are land and sea use change, overexploitation, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Global Biodiversity Outlook 5 came out the year after, and this found that none of the 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, which had been developed in 2010, had been fully achieved. So a lot more progress is needed to make sure that the targets for this framework are achieved. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework is meant for the next 10-year period, so up to 2030. And the framework itself and the accompanying decisions were presented to the parties as what the presidency called a compromise package. So it doesn't just include the Global Biodiversity Framework, but there's also a framework for monitoring, there's a resource mobilization strategy, there's a framework for capacity building, and a decision on digital sequence information on genetic resources, or DSI. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so just as an overview, the mission of the framework is consistent with the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, which appears on the screen. There are 4 long-term goals consistent with the mission and vision, and also the objectives of the Convention on Biological Diversity. So we won't go through the goals individually since our time together is short this afternoon, but Goal A pertains to the conservation of biodiversity, Goal B to the sustainable use of its components, Goal C on the fair and equitable sharing of benefits from biodiversity, and significantly, the new framework refers to genetic resources, digital sequence information on genetic resources, and traditional knowledge associated with genetic resources. The inclusion of DSI, or digital sequence information here, has been a point of contention for parties over 10 years. And then lastly, Goal D pertains to the means of implementation. So there needs to be adequate means of implementation, including financial resources, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, and technology transfer. So there are also 23 action-oriented targets. We'll go through some of them, but we won't have enough time to go through them individually today, so we will highlight some. But generally, these goals and targets are global. So parties contribute towards meeting them based on their national circumstances, priorities, and capacities. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so just to summarize the targets, they're generally grouped together under three themes or subheadings. They're generally classified according to what they pertain to. So the first set are the targets that pertain to reducing threats to biodiversity. This is targets 1 to 8. So an example of these targets would be target 2 on the restoration of degraded ecosystems, or target 4 on halting human-induced extinctions of threatened species. The next set of targets, or targets 9 to 13, pertain to sustainable use and benefit sharing. So for example, target 11 pertains to restoring, maintaining, and enhancing ecosystem services through nature-based solutions and ecosystems-based approaches. And target 13 pertains to fair and equitable benefit sharing. So it seeks a significant increase in the benefits shared from biodiversity use by 2030. And then the last set of targets pertains to the tools and solutions for implementation and mainstreaming. So here we see a lot of things like target 16, which supports sustainable consumption. And then on the means of implementation, target 19 for resource mobilization. Targets 22 and 23 also reflect the rights-based approach that the framework says it has to adopt for the implementation of all the activities under it. So target 22 pertains to indigenous peoples and local communities, children and the youth, persons with disabilities, and environmental human rights defenders. And target 13 is providing opportunities for women and girls. Next slide, please. Okay, so we don't have time to go through all 23 targets, but I did want to briefly highlight how the Global Biodiversity Framework intersects with the other topics that my colleagues will discuss here today. These are also significant because pollution and climate change are major drivers of biodiversity loss and ecosystems degradation as identified by the IPBES global assessment. So if we look at both targets, target 7 on pollution and target 8 on climate change, the phrasing is relatively open-ended. So for example, here on target 7, levels that are not harmful to biodiversity and ecosystem functions and services can mean many things, different things in different countries. So to in target 8, minimizing impact and increasing resilience can also mean many things. So the indicators for determining whether these targets have been met or not will be especially important. So other things I'd like to highlight here are how the target on pollution identifies plastic pollution specifically, and how the target on climate change explicitly identifies nature-based solutions and ecosystems-based approaches. So nature-based solutions, as some of us may know, has also been used by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it was recently defined by the UN Environment Assembly. So these are the most explicit targets on pollution and climate change, I'd say, but others are relevant also. So target 11 on ecosystem services is relevant to climate change. Target 16 on sustainable consumption also seeks to reduce waste generated from overconsumption. And target 19 on resource mobilization seeks to optimize the co-benefits of biodiversity and climate finance. So this is also consistent with the consideration of enhancing cooperation, collaboration, and synergy between the UN Convention on Biodiversity and other relevant multilateral environmental processes. So given the intersections and interactions of the many environmental crises that we face, even as conventions try as much as they can to stay within their own jurisdiction, so to speak. Okay, so my next few slides will go through some observations on the framework. So if we might move to the next one, please. I have 4 general observations, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. They're observations from Parabukas and also considering those from other civil society organizations and experts following the process. So the first of these is some of the targets seem clear and are more ambitious than others. So I say clear in the sense of them being time-bound with a numerical target to aim for, while others provide general parameters which can be established maybe later on by additional scientific research. So an example in this regard would be target 3, which is called the 30 by 30 target, which a lot of organizations did advocate for. In summary, this basically says that by 2030, at least 30% of areas, so these are terrestrial, marine, wetlands areas, and the like, especially those that are especially important for biodiversity and ecosystem services, should be effectively conserved and managed through protected area systems, other area-based conservation measures with recognition for indigenous peoples and traditional territories. Another target that is clear in terms of time and number is target 18, which seeks to identify harmful incentives and subsidies. So incentives and subsidies that are harmful to biodiversity by 2025, and then reduce these significantly. So by $500 billion by 2030. So target 19 on resource mobilization also has explicit targets, and I'll get to that in a bit. As mentioned, other targets have space for hopefully science and additional research to establish the parameters more clearly, with space for differences among ecosystems and local circumstances. Some of these targets are also addressed by other plans. So for example, target 23 on gender equality is supported by a new gender plan of action, which has indicative actions and possible deliverables, so progress might be able to be tracked that way. And as mentioned, target 7 on pollution has a fairly open-ended phrasing for how much reduction should be done. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so on resource mobilization, as with most, if not all, multilateral environmental agreements, discussions on resource mobilization and finance are among the most challenging, the most contentious. So at the Biodiversity COP, the deadlock on resource mobilization negotiations did lead to many developing countries walking out one evening over disagreements on how finance for biodiversity could be increased. And the walkout was one of the reasons why the Chinese presidency had to put a compromise package together. So even at the closing stages, resource mobilization remained a contentious topic, with one country, so the DRC, expressing that they could not accept the framework without the inclusion of a global biodiversity fund, even if they later agreed to have the reservation reflected in the record of the meeting instead. So briefly, target 19, which pertains to resource mobilization, seeks to substantially and progressively increase finance from all sources. So by 2030, the target is to mobilize $200 billion per year. But of this $200 billion, the financial resources of developed countries to developing countries is much smaller. So the target for official development assistance and financial resources from developed to developing countries is 20 billion US dollars per year by 2025 and 30 billion US dollars per year by 2030. Other sources include domestic resources, the private sector, what the framework calls innovative schemes like payment for ecosystem services, green bonds. The very contentious notion of biodiversity offsets is also included here. And there's also mention of collective actions from communities. So part of the package, the compromise package with the framework included a decision on resource mobilization. And this does not completely shut the door on a global biodiversity fund. So what countries had wanted to see was a global biodiversity fund, a little similar to the Green Climate Fund under the UNFCCC. So there is mention of a global biodiversity fund, but this is currently under the Global Environment Facility. So it has to go through the processes and requirements of the GEF. The GEF is supposed to establish this fund, which will support the implementation of the framework by this year. And there's an advisory committee that's been convened to explore more options. So perhaps this fund can be taken out of the GEF in the future. For resource mobilization, there's also a decision to establish a multilateral benefit sharing mechanism for the benefits from digital sequence information, which could include a global fund. But this is in very early stages, so we'll see how it shapes up. Okay, yeah, I think, yes, since Matthew is back, I will just point out that resource mobilization is an issue to watch because the success of the framework will depend on whether there is finance for many countries, for many communities to meet some of the targets, as my colleagues had earlier expressed. At present, the biodiversity finance gap is very, very significant and far, far more than what the commitment has, than the commitment that has been made in the framework. Okay, so I think I will discuss one more observation before I wrap up briefly. So the next observation is, so next slide, please, is, sorry, next slide, please. The next observation is on rights. Oop. Yeah, on rights. So the framework is explicit that the implementation must follow a rights-based approach. So there are important references to rights, particularly of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, children and the youth, persons with disabilities, and environmental defenders in the decision and also in the targets. I think this is important because implementation of many actions, even if they seek to protect and conserve biodiversity, has resulted in violations of rights, including those of indigenous peoples and local communities who have been displaced because of the traditional fortress conservation model for protecting important ecosystems. So the targets now call for full, inclusive, and effective participation in decision-making, access to justice and information, and respect for rights. And I think that the reference to the need to ensure the full protection of environmental defenders in Target 22 is also important because it recognizes the very dangerous climate that we're in, where threats to environmental defenders can come from private individuals and in some countries from the state as well. I had one more observation. I'm not sure, Matthew, if I have time to go through it very, very quickly.
Please, please.
Okay, so the last observation pertains to the private sector. So many civil society organizations generally consider the framework's language on the private sector to be insufficient. This is under Target 15. So under Target 15, governments are asked to take policy measures that ensure and encourage businesses to disclose the risks and impacts on biodiversity, provide information and report on compliance with access and benefit sharing measures, and it doesn't make these mandatory. So ensure and encourage is generally considered to be very weak language as opposed to making disclosures a mandatory requirement. Prior to COP, 300 businesses did have a coalition supporting the call for mandatory disclosures, but this was not what was reflected in the text in the end. So the target as currently phrased relies on voluntary action, self-reporting essentially, and effectiveness of these kinds of mechanisms in the past has been limited, right? So there are no clear private sector obligations under the framework, and it's considered a missed opportunity. So just to wrap up, I just like to thank everyone again. And I think just by way of reminding myself also, sometimes negotiations can be very dry and wordy and exhausting processes. But I think it's always important for us to remember who it's for. So we always lose ourselves in the words, but biodiversity is about people. It's about communities and the many other lives that we share the world with and depend on so closely. So it's actually up to us to make sure that the words translate into something that's really helpful and beneficial for them too. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for a really amazing summary of what is contained within that the Global Biodiversity Framework. And I think there's some really interesting points, and I know that some of the questions in the Q&A have picked up on that. And it's interesting that finishing off with that point on the private sector, I think, is a good lead-in to one of the other big issues that has emerged over the last few years, which is plastics. So for that, we're going to our last speaker, Andres de Castillo. He is a senior attorney for the Centre for International Environmental Law, supporting the legal aspects of the plastic treaty negotiations. He joined CIEL in 2020 after more than 8 years of experience in engaging with UN human rights monitoring institutions and multilateral environmental negotiations, as well as several years working in private sector and insurance law. He's an expert on Indigenous people's rights with a strong background in climate change, the environment, and business and human rights. His past work includes a mix of legal advising and strategic engagement with organisations like the European Union, the UN Global Compact, the UN Human Rights Office, the World Bank, and the World Economic Forum. He came to CIEL from the Indigenous Peoples Documentation Centre, where he spearheaded the process to be recognised by UNESCO as World Documented Heritage, which was granted in 2017. Andres, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us today to talk about plastics. And as you can see from the Q&A, there's a lot of questions already there. So please, the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. And I hope that you can share the screen, some of you, for the presentation that I have. So we can visualize a little bit what I'm saying with my words. And I will let to the end the explanation of these rhinoceros in a boat in an ocean full of plastics. But the second slide, please. So as Nicole was saying before, one of the their intersection, this one, perfect. There is, of course, intersections and links between the three planetary crises. On biodiversity, we are happy and glad to see that one of the targets include specifically plastics. That was not the case for the IH targets from 2010. And apart from, of course, saying that the mention is important, what also was important was to keep the ambition on the language, right? The title of what we call the mandate for negotiating a plastic treaty is called End Plastic Pollution. From the title, you can see the level of ambition. And we can see reflecting in this target 7 a big level of ambition from the prevention, the reduction, and the elimination of plastic pollution. Now it will be important to see more in detail the indicators for how to measure this specific target. Noting also that this biodiversity framework has a specific timeline or deadline that is 2030, and hopefully the treaty will be adopted by 2025, so will be an early target if we understand that right. So it's a good sign of ambition from different countries that together say, yes, there is also something to do, and the relation with biodiversity decline and plastics. And at the right of your screen also you see this connection with what Ramchat was talking about, that is the climate crisis. And there is a new report from UNOMIA that is called is the net zero enough for the material production sector. And one of the main conclusions is that instead of growing by 4% annually, plastic production needs to decline 3% every year to halve by 2050. And this will represent a reduction of 75% of per capita consumption. This is important to say because the carbon budget right now, if we keep the plastic production, consumption, and use and disposal in the way that we are that it is right now, that could emit around 56 gigatons of greenhouse gases by 2050, which account for around 13% or more of the Earth's remaining carbon budget, if we want to keep a world below 1.0 degrees. Next slide, please. So I will spend a little more time on this timeline, which kind of give us an update where we are right now. It's easy to identify where we are right now by the red dot that is there, or pin that is there. But let's take a step back and go to what happened last year. Mainly on plastic, we have this mandate that was adopted by UNEA, United Nations Environmental Assembly, in 2022, early in the year. And we have two specific meetings related to the plastic treaty. One was a preliminary meeting at the end of May in Dakar, Senegal, and where mainly the draft of procedure were recommended to adoption by the first INC, or Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, in Uruguay, with some brackets, of course. And then they also recommend to establish 5 rounds of negotiations from starting in November and ending in December 2024, and having a diplomatic conference, or conference of plenipotentiaries, that is a conference where countries expect to sign and to adopt the treaty, right? That need to happen in 2025. But then also in Dakar was kind of set up this idea of having not 10 members of the bureau, that is kind of the executive committee of the INC, but 11 members, including small island developing states. And so far, we have appointments from different regions of the world, 2 per region, and there is no decision of the bureau so far, because there is one of the regions that remain kind of open, or we candidate, right? But is something more related to when that decision on the bureau will be taken. We hope that will be early at the beginning of the second round of negotiation of the INC, taking place in Paris in May 2029. But going back to what happened in Uruguay in December or late November in Punta del Este, we know that there was kind of an agreement to provisionally apply the rules of procedure. And this is what happened then, to work on, or one of the main conclusions was to work mainly in 2 clusters, one more related to the substantial parts, and the other more the operation, like the logistical and means of implementation parts. But there is a need of more clarity on where the means of implementation discussion is going to happen, in one, or in the cluster 1 or cluster 2, since it's a cross-cutting and really, really important issue that was highlighted by many countries, especially countries coming from the global south. So in this meeting in Uruguay, also there was a request from the INC members to UNEP to dedicate their time to produce a report on elements for the future treaty. And by the elements, I mean what can be the objective of the treaty, what can be the control measures and obligations for the treaty, and other kind of provisions. This kind of request aimed to have a gravitational document to discuss and to give more at the rhythm to the discussions and the negotiations that will take place in Paris in the last week of May, beginning of June, where at the UNESCO headquarters, all the countries that want to participate will negotiate and discuss this document on control measures, right? And where we are right now is in between the deadline for stakeholder submissions that will inform this report by UNEP and the states submissions that where they need to send something by February 10th, right? There is some groups, some members that are requesting an extension of the deadline, like the GRULAC region, the Latin American, the Caribbean region, is asking for an extension since the deadline is too tight for them. But so far, there are more than 164 submissions by different sectors from stakeholders, from NGOs to frontline communities to waste pickers to businesses to indigenous peoples. Also, we saw already some submission by members, like around 6, if I'm not wrong, yesterday. And then, of course, we expect more participation by governments and by regions by the deadline that is February 10th. But something also to highlight is this high ambition coalition that was announced at UNEA, like in 2022 in March, but was officially launched in July, if I'm not wrong, 2022. That is a coalition with around more than 50 countries that they call themselves a high ambition coalition to end plastic pollution by 2040. And this is important to highlight too, because I was looking yesterday at the list of the countries that are member of this high ambition coalition, and there is not a single member for Southeast Asia so far. So this is also an invitation to look at this high ambition coalition for the countries that are interested in really tackling this crisis. So then what we expect this year is, as I say, one round of negotiation happening in May in Paris, and the second round of negotiation taking place in Nairobi by the end of November this year. And we expect that with the discussions taking place in Paris, we are going to have enough tools and material to suggest to UNEP to produce, or to whatever is decided by the INC, to produce a specific draft or zero draft of what will be a plastic treaty.
And just 5 minutes to go, just to give you.
Perfect. Thank you. Next slide, please. So this is one of, I want to go more deep on what CIAL's proposed as an objective of the plastic treaty, and it's trying to reflect the discussions of what happened in Uruguay. Mainly, there was a strong support that was not the case for the UNEA resolution to include the human health concerns and together with the environmental concerns into the scope of the plastic treaty. So that need to be reflected, of course, in the objective. And we need to tackle not only the risk associated with plastics, but also the hazards and different impacts that are taking place, the inclusion of microplastics too, and then, of course, the length of a full life cycle starting for production, using a precautionary principle. Even if we don't have certitude of every single thing, we have enough data and information to act, and a right-based approach. Taking also in consideration what Ramchat was saying about the recognition last year, the right to health and a clean and sustainable environment. Next slide, please. And of course, when we talk about the full life cycle of plastics, we talk about the upstream part, and the upstream part is really complicated. It's not as easy as saying that plastics starts or come to life with polymerization, but we understand that the plastic treaty need to cover and need to have some specific control and global measures on the plastic feedstocks, on plastic precursors, and plastic materials. So this is important to see that the crisis is not only a crisis of plastic products littering or found in beaches, but also is a problem of the overflow, oversupply of plastic production that currently accounts with more than 400 million tons of plastics. Next slide, please. So here, just to clarify this definition of what we understand with plastic precursors, that will be crucial to identify that within the plastic treaty, and is mainly the building blocks and polymers and related chemical like additive that need to be controlled through global objective and rules. And there is a list that we are developing on the amount of the basic chemicals that are produced mainly using fossil fuels, and that need to be control. Otherwise, there is no way how any waste management system can bear the weight of the plastic crisis. Next slide, please. I don't think that I will have the time to go through all the 8 different control measures that we propose, but I want to focus on this first one, that is something that the plastic treaty can do, is to reduce and phase out the production and consumption of the most problematic plastic precursors and materials, and also start to phase down the reliability on fossil fuel-based plastics. And what we understand is that some countries are calling more for a specific agreement with a form of a convention with annexes. And here we see an annex on phase out with a negative list, and annex B on reduction with a gray list of what are the list of those precursors that need to be phase out and reduce, of course, with general exceptions that will be defined after by the COP, and specific or special exceptions of kind of production of these polymers or building blocks or additive with temporary basis and only for essential uses. So I guess we can go next slide, please. Then the next part will be a phase out of petrochemical subsidies for plastic feedstock and precursors. Next slide, please. Then a reduction on production, consumption, and use of fossil-based feedstocks, precursors, and materials. And these include political tools like a moratorium on permitting new or the expansion of our facilities. Next slide, please. Then, of course, we will need provision related to primary microplastic or intentional added microplastics too. Next slide, please. Then a compliance on the production of plastics with human rights and with environmental justice standards too. This will be really important to make sure that that is strong enough, the framework. Next slide, please. Then the need to data on production, collection, and reporting, that is something that will need to be reflected in a future instrument. Next slide, please. And almost ending, this is almost the last one, is a non-party provisions on the trade of plastic feedstock and precursors. We have a material, when you have the link of the PowerPoint presentation, you can go deeply to the explanation of what we mean by this non-party provision, mainly for the trade that will happen between parties of the future treaty and non-parties. And next slide, please, to end. And financial mechanisms, tax and charge and fees, this will be crucial, as Nicole was saying, also on biodiversity. It's important to notice that we need a coordinated fee that will be something that won't change the behavior of the production, but will help to implement all the measures from the plastic treaty. Next slide, please. This is just to wrap up. The this is scientific. This comes from a scientific paper on how to solve the plastic crisis, and scientists are using different resources to make sure that that there is action and something happens. And this is a quote where they quote Fellini moment, or say like, what are we gonna do now with the plastic crisis? And for me, that I was curious to see how scientists are using this kind of tools to make sure that people pay attention to what they are saying. There is enough science to act right now, and political will too. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Andres, and Nicole as well. For, I mean, we knew it was quite ambitious. We set ambitious targets: climate change, biodiversity, and plastics, all in an hour and a half. We're now at the end of the official time. I'm just hoping if you could stay on for a few more minutes, because we have got a lot of really interesting questions in the Q&A box. And first of all, can I say to all of our participants, we had 350 registrations for today's event. So thank you all very much for your support. There is a registration list. If you click on that and fill it in so that we can send you a certificate of attendance. There's also, doing that can subscribe to our mailing list for future events. And I think one of the things that both your presentations has highlighted is that there's going to be a lot of things happening this year, and things that we need to communicate with civil society and communities and stakeholders. There's a number of questions, and I'm probably not going to do it justice, so I apologize to some of our participants. But I just wanted to ask, there's one question from Remy Kinner from the International Watercourses Convention of the UN based in Geneva, and he asked the question, what has been the discussion so far in the various meetings and INC and Source to Sea plastic pollution and treaty regimes? It's the coherence between freshwater and marine law frameworks. And he says it's particularly important for Asia when more than half of the world's rivers, major rivers exist, including transboundary rivers, and they contribute significantly to transmigration of marine plastic pollution from land to ocean. So I was wondering, just in that question, what has been the discussions about coherence between the freshwater regimes and marine law frameworks? I also, think it's really exciting that both of you and also Romchat and Georgie mentioned that we're now looking at these connections between plastics and climate change, plastics and biodiversity, biodiversity and climate change, and above all, the idea of a human right to a functioning ecosystem, which also includes not just human rights, but environmental rights as well. So sorry, that's that roundabout questions, but Andreas, in terms of how much has that discussion been on those coherence and congruence or interconnected between the various existing treaty regimes and the new proposed plastics treaty?
Yep, this is a really interesting question because mainly from the beginning of the negotiation of the mandate, and even before at UNEA, the scope of the plastic crisis was more narrow to marine litter or debris. Now we're talking about the full life cycle of plastics, and not only on the marine environment, but also in all environments. And this is clear, and this is kind of the discussion that took place in Nairobi, but over and over, they emphasize governments that they need to work on all the environments and mainly on prevention. And the full life cycle includes this question of production. If we don't close the tap, there is no way how we can control the amount of plastic that is growing and growing. And on the question of the Asian rivers, yes, I posted in one of the questions that was that this is apologies made by Ocean Conservancy on one of the reports that did kind of wrong assumptions, whether it's kind of blaming 5 countries in South Asia for what happened, and also directly promoting incineration. And there is a public apologize and a process that they are doing for remediation on that part. And I guess we need to start, and countries are now acknowledge this is not just a problem of a specific area, but what happened in the Pacific also, in South Asia, and the Pacific, is that they are recipients of a huge amount of tons of plastic waste every single month. And there is data on that, despite the Basel Amendment on plastic waste, it is still being a huge problem. And this is where we need to focus too, is like making sure that the plastic treaty perhaps include a provision to stop or ban the exportation of plastics waste to other countries, period. So thank you.
And so, yes, so thanks. And we have that question about the Basel Convention and the various bans in terms of the plastic ban. But the plastic treaty is going beyond just sort of waste, isn't it? It really is looking at the beginnings of the plastic life cycle, whatever we could call that. So do you think, again, sort of, the connections between sort of the Basel Convention and the relevant bans, and is that something that's going to be tied into the plastics treaty, or is it going to be, is that plastics treaty going to be newer or not deal with trade, I guess?
Yeah, like one of the main conclusions was the non-duplication of efforts and cooperation, saying, of course, we can't assume that other conventions will take lead on plastic. They have been doing that, and there are many good projects and works going on there. But what we assume with this plastic treaty is, let's avoid duplication, but make sure also that the plastic treaty try to cover with an start then strength approach what will need to happen. So we hope that there will be some specific rules on cooperation, and depends not only Basel, but we see the biodiversity convention really important with this idea of what can be the next materials of substitutes or alternative it exists, and how that can risk and trigger, biodiversity. Also, to wrap up, the Stockholm Convention is very important here with the POPs or persistent organic pollutants there. So we hope that the plastic treaty have a different approach. Instead of listing substance by substance, we'll list by group. The PFAS is not one by one substance, but we'll list by group. And of course, complementing with what Stockholm has already done so far. Thank you
very much. And so, Nicole, I mean, it's interesting that the I guess the recommitment to an ambitious biodiversity approach, given that the Aichi targets were not met, and one always wonders when you're moving to the next set of ambitious targets when you haven't achieved your first. But nevertheless, but one of the some of the questions which have come through the Q&A, which I think are really interesting, is we're obviously seeing greater commitment to environmental regulation, and at a whole range of issues, whether it's carbon or methane for climate change, issues of stopping or halting land degradation for biodiversity protection, regulation or management of plastics and plastic waste and plastic pollution, and that will have all sort of more clear impacts on business. And so a number of people have asked, and this, I guess, a question to both of you is, how will this going forward commitment to environmental protection impact on people, on workers and workers' rights? There is a question: will the obligations that are going to be imposed on developing countries mean that they won't be able to develop their standard of living, and that people will suffer? Is it going to be developing countries that are yet again going to bear the cost of paying for Western lifestyles? And also, I guess that question is, how are these going to impact on the role of business? Is it going to make it more difficult, or will it mean that businesses will have to move towards better or different products? So, big question, but it's certainly some of the questions that have come out of the Q&A today.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a very important question, because at least in the Biodiversity Convention, what's very clear there is that there's a role for everybody. This is not something that we can leave up to just state action anymore, but communities have parts to play, and the private sector has a part to play as well. And I think for some businesses, there's already a growing recognition that their business models, the way that they do business, does depend on healthy and functioning ecosystems. So it's actually in their interest to make sure that these are not lost in the long term. A lot of the time, it's also a matter of balancing interests. What does that mean against, the bottom line? What does that mean for the investors? But because of that, I guess, recognition of the role of biodiversity and the risks of things like climate change and disasters on how business is conducted, there's been a greater effort, not just at the leadership of business, but shareholders as well, to make sure that processes and regulations internal to businesses are also, I guess, improved to take environmental safeguards into account. I'd also say that a lot more countries are making sure that there are policy regulations that are up to step with that. So even if disclosures are not mandatory under the global framework, in the Philippines, for example, there is already a requirement for sustainability reporting, at least for some companies in the country, and that can be something that can be used to hold businesses accountable. So there is quite a ways to go, and the businesses are only one end of the equation. There's also that whole discussion on how the developing world can, improve the standard of living for its citizens when, so many of the resources have been lost to history because of colonial experiences and industrialization from developed countries. And that's a deeper conversation of justice that I think always needs to be had, always needs to be brought to mind in the context of the conventions. It usually comes up in relation to finance, because of, in the UNFCCC, common but differentiated responsibilities and the like. And in the Biodiversity Convention, there's a bit of resistance in mirroring those words exactly, common but differentiated responsibilities, in a different convention. But there should be, I think that there should be a similar effort there just to make sure that the habitat loss and degradation isn't just displaced, essentially, from developed countries to developing countries, many of which are also mega diverse.
And I think that it probably is that growing recognition, and we saw this certainly in the discussions about the right to a clean, safe and healthy environment, that we're now facing that triple planetary crisis is happening now. And that means that individuals are suffering through loss of land and loss of environment and loss of access to all the things that make their life able to be lived. And that's disproportionately affecting vulnerable communities and developing countries, because the Western countries, northern countries, have actually sort of insulated themselves through that past history of colonialism and exploitation. So environmental justice and those sort of issues still need to be at the forefront. I mean, I guess, Andres, in terms of the plastics negotiation, I mean, plastics are, we've seen this argument, I guess, when we were talking about climate change, where the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry say, well, you can't do without us. The mining industry, when they're destroying habitats, say you can't do without us. And presumably the plastics industry are saying the same thing. But how is these new priorities, I guess, for environmental conservation, how do you think they're going to impact on the negotiations, especially the very ambitious negotiations that are planned for the plastics treaty?
Yeah, the good news is that there's a broad amount of constituencies we have, from frontline communities that are affected by the production facilities of plastics, petrochemical facilities, to indigenous peoples. We need more funding for supporting their direct participation, right? And of course, one of the main groups is waste pickers too, that have a specific recognition for the first time, kind of in the UN at that scale. And that is a group that need also support to make sure that whatever changes are happening as a consequence of the plastic treaty, they are not the one that are affected the first. For that, there is discussions and no consensus on the role of businesses. From our side, yes, some countries support the idea that business need to be part of the solution, but if there is no safeguards on their participation, we are gonna end it with what is going on with the COP, with the appointment of a CEO of one of the main drivers of climate change as the one preceding the negotiations, right? So if there is no safeguards and limits, will be a problem. And mainly we see even in the business, some progressive business saying, yes, we want to do more and we need global rules for that, but within the same community of business, we have the big oil and gas and the petrochemicals there too, saying we are part of the solution, but we don't see any change. We see that there are more than 300 expansion or new projects of petrochemicals. In Asia is growing that number of new facilities that will increase the problem. So what we and some other groups are saying is like, let's distinguish between some businesses and some of the perpetrators, or the ones that they don't apologize. They come to the meeting and they don't say, sorry, we are doing this, let's change, and this is our plan to change. So we are seeing more litigation on that case too, for greenwashing, or for companies claiming something that is not true, or claiming and then changing what they claimed before. So we are going to see more litigation as a tool for that safeguards kind of, but at the international level, we need a framework. And so far there is not a framework in the discussions to make sure that there is not the negotiation is not capped. But we need there is a role for them, and the role is the principle of pay for what they have been causing. Thank you.
And I guess, Nicole, that yes, one of the big criticisms of the last climate change COP was the 1,000 of fossil fuel lobbyists that were in the room while civil society were outside. And the future, where you've actually got, yes, you should say the new co-chair is someone who is the part of the problem rather than the solution. Is that the same in the biodiversity COP, or is it a little bit more different in that area?
Well, yes, I think the concern of corporate capture of COPs and all of these processes is a concern across the board. As mentioned earlier, the target on mandatory disclosures, that didn't involve some of the larger corporations all around the world. So no Amazon, no Microsoft, and with that. So that's really something that that a lot of civil society advocates are watching very closely. And I think also to the point of Andres about greenwash, that's something that's also a big concern in the biodiversity COP, especially with the identification of offsets or biodiversity offsets as something that could be a source of finance mobilized for biodiversity. But offsets aren't really changing the business model. It's just more of the same, and like paying so that the risks are transferred elsewhere. So yeah, there are definitely corporate capture concerns that should be watched closely.
And I've always had my concerns about offsets, and in Australia recently, where they've had a very very advanced, very detailed offset for biodiversity issues for development. They've found that 90% of those offsets didn't occur and certainly didn't produce the benefit. So what actually had happened is that all of the developments did actually have significant negative environmental impacts that were not offset elsewhere by benefits, which then leads to the idea of, well, given we have principles of polluter pays and principles of prevention, why acts that are likely to cause harm to the environment and society, the polluter or the instigator or the proponent doesn't actually pay for the consequences. So I think this is where we've had some really interesting things happening over the last 6 months. I think the plastics negotiations are going to be interesting because it's a very ambitious target, but we also know that it's very, very prevalent, and it's become an issue that is really on the agenda of government. So hopefully those ambitions can be achieved. So can I thank Andres and Nicole for your presentations today, and we look forward to sharing your presentations to the registration. And so on that note, I certainly would like to sort of bring the presentations and the webinar to a close. It's been a really exciting and updating moment to provide and cover so much ground for so many key issues. One of the things I just wanted also to say is that the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, with our partners, Law Asia, UN Environment Program, the College of Law, and our program partners we've worked with before, such as Parabucas and others, we will be planning an extensive series of webinars to really reach out to people on these key issues and follow them up over the course of this year. The Deputy Director, Rocky Guzman, will also be attending some of the negotiations on the Plastics Treaty, and is actually going to be in America on a conference on ocean equity at Duke University. I'm attending a Sustainability Asia forum by The Economist magazine. One of the things they're going to ask about climate litigation, and one of my responses is I think there's going to be a lot more litigation happening. And it's not just going to be against governments to enforce policies, but it's going to be against directors for failure of action by directors of companies, and it's going to be failure of companies. And whether it's requirements for compensation and damage for specific projects, or liability for, as we now find, that companies such as Exxon and others and Shell had data on climate change and knew that what they were doing was going to cause significant environmental harm. And I think we saw that within the tobacco litigation 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that there's going to be serious questions that have to be asked about why these companies not only continue to do what they were doing as part of their business models, but deliberately try to prevent and avoid acknowledging the consequences of their action. And so I think that's where some of the loss and damage arguments, some of the new issues in the new biodiversity framework is going to be really, really exciting. So thank you all very much. It's going to be an exciting year for environmental law, if I can put excitement and environmental law together. But we do look forward. Please join us. Next month is going to be a particularly important one for Ariel. We are working with the UN Environment Program and some other partners for our next webinar, which will be on breaking the glass ceiling in environmental law, looking at the role of women and women lawyers. I should say we've been fortunate to have an extraordinary collection of amazing women as environmental lawyers who are truly leaders in our region on environmental law. So we're going to have a webinar on that, and we're going to follow it up with the Seeds of Justice. So thank you very much again to our presenters and our panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you all of our participants and for your questions. I think that's the most number of questions we've ever had in any of our webinars. Sorry, we couldn't answer them all, but we look forward to continuing the discussion and the debate and the discussions in the course of 2023. Again, thank you very much indeed, and look forward to seeing you again next month. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye.